In the dark and uncertain years of the early 1940s, as World War II consumed the world and nations fought desperately for survival, a new kind of race began, one not for land or power, but for the control of nature's most hidden and terrifying secret. For decades, scientists had dreamed of unlocking the immense energy trapped within the atom. In 1938, two German chemists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, achieved what many thought impossible. They split the uranium atom and released a staggering amount of energy. The discovery of nuclear fission spread like wildfire through the global scientific community. But the implications were terrifying. If such energy could be controlled, it could produce a weapon of unimaginable destruction. And in Nazi Germany, under Hitler's shadow, that possibility took on a dreadful urgency. Jewish scientists fleeing Europe, among them Albert Einstein, Leo Szilard, and Edward Teller, carried both knowledge and fear across the Atlantic. They realized that if the Germans were the first to build an atomic bomb, the consequences for humanity could be catastrophic. Szilard and Einstein drafted a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1939, warning that Germany might be pursuing such a weapon. Roosevelt, cautious but aware of the danger, responded by forming the Advisory Committee on Uranium. It was a small step, almost invisible in the chaos of war, yet it marked the beginning of what would become the most secret and expensive scientific project in human history, the Manhattan Project. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States fully entered the war, and the pressure to find a decisive weapon increased dramatically. In 1942, General Leslie Groves, known for his iron will and organizational genius, was chosen to lead the effort. He selected a brilliant and complex physicist, J. Robert Oppenheimer, to direct the scientific side of the project. Oppenheimer, both a visionary and a philosopher, gathered some of the brightest minds of the 20th century under one roof. The name Manhattan came from the location of the early offices, but the project's scope would soon stretch across the continent. Secret sites were built in remote locations: Oak Ridge, Tennessee, for uranium enrichment; Hanford, Washington, for plutonium production; Los Alamos, New Mexico, for design and assembly. Entire cities rose from empty land. Thousands of men and women worked day and night without knowing the true purpose of their labor. They were told only that their mission would help end the war. Security was absolute. Curiosity was forbidden.
At Los Alamos, Oppenheimer and his team faced the impossible. They had to take abstract equations and turn them into a working bomb. They studied how to achieve critical mass, how to sustain a chain reaction, how to ignite the unimaginable. Around him gathered a constellation of brilliance: Enrico Fermi, Niels Bohr, Richard Feynman, Hans Bethe, and many others. Each contributed a fragment of genius to the puzzle. Yet, beneath their enthusiasm ran an undercurrent of unease. They understood the potential consequences of their creation. Two different paths emerged: the uranium bomb, codenamed Little Boy, and the plutonium bomb, Fat Man. Both relied on entirely different principles. The uranium bomb was simpler in theory but required rare material. The plutonium bomb, on the other hand, demanded perfect symmetry of implosion, a feat that pushed the limits of physics and engineering. Countless experiments were conducted with explosive lenses and detonators. Failures were common. Time was short.
By 1945, as Germany collapsed and Japan continued to fight, the bomb was nearly ready. The scientists gathered in the desert of New Mexico near a place called Alamogordo. In the early hours of July 16, 1945, they prepared for the first test. The codename was Trinity. At exactly 5:29 a.m.,
The desert was lit by a light brighter than the sun. The fireball expanded, turning night into day, and a column of smoke and flame rose miles into the sky. The earth trembled. The birth of the atomic age had come. Oppenheimer watched silently. In that moment, a line from the ancient Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, passed through his mind. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Humanity had entered a new era, one defined by both triumph and terror. The test was a success. The world would never be the same. Within weeks, as the war in the Pacific dragged on, American leaders made the fateful decision to use the bomb. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped Little Boy over Hiroshima. A flash, a roar, and then silence. Tens of thousands perished instantly. 3 days later, Fat Man fell upon Nagasaki. The destruction was total. Japan surrendered soon after. The war was over.
The Manhattan Project had achieved its goal. But victory came with a heavy price. The scientists who had built the bomb now faced a haunting question. Had they unleashed something that could never be controlled? Oppenheimer, once celebrated as a national hero, soon became a symbol of moral conflict. He spoke out against the development of even more powerful weapons and was eventually stripped of his security clearance during the Red Scare. The man who had opened the door to the nuclear age was cast out by the very country he had served. The project itself had cost more than $2 billion and involved over 130,000 people. It transformed science, warfare, and geopolitics forever. The atomic bomb ended one war but began another, the Cold War, as the Soviet Union rushed to build its own nuclear arsenal. Espionage, secrecy, and fear became global realities. The legacy of the Manhattan Project remains a paradox, a triumph of human intellect and a tragedy of human morality. It proved that mankind could master the atom, but it also revealed that knowledge without wisdom could lead to ruin. From the deserts of New Mexico to the ruins of Hiroshima, the echoes of that first explosion still linger. A reminder that once humanity touched the fire of creation, it could never again claim innocence.
When the war ended in 1945, the world stood in stunned silence, trying to grasp what had just occurred. 2 cities had been erased from existence, and a weapon unlike any in history had revealed its power to both end wars and threaten civilization itself. The United States, now the only nation possessing the atomic bomb, found itself in an entirely new position of global dominance. Yet with that power came unease, because what had been created in the deserts of New Mexico could not be uncreated. The knowledge was out, and other nations would not rest until they had it too. The scientists who had labored under Oppenheimer's direction returned to universities and laboratories, but many carried a heavy burden. They had witnessed what no human mind was meant to see. Some, like Enrico Fermi and Niels Bohr, warned of a coming arms race. Others believed the bomb would make large-scale wars impossible, that fear itself might preserve peace. But that illusion would not last long. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly and beginning the long, tense standoff that would define the second half of the 20th century. The Cold War had begun, and the atomic shadow fell across the planet.
The United States responded with the creation of the hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than those dropped on Japan. Men like Edward Teller pushed for its development, arguing that only by staying ahead could America remain safe, while Oppenheimer and many of his colleagues opposed it, seeing it as a step toward annihilation. The debates turned bitter and political. In an atmosphere thick with paranoia and suspicion, the same nation that had once celebrated Oppenheimer now turned against him. During the early 1950s, as the fear of communism swept through America, loyalty oaths, investigations, and accusations became weapons of their own. Oppenheimer's opposition to the hydrogen bomb and his earlier associations with leftist intellectuals made him a target. In 1954, after a humiliating security hearing, he was stripped of his clearance, symbolically exiled from the scientific world he had helped to build. The father of the atomic bomb became its first victim. Yet in his fall, he became something larger, a conscience for a world intoxicated by its own power.
Meanwhile, the Cold War deepened. United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a deadly competition, not only for nuclear supremacy, but also for ideological dominance. Cities dug bomb shelters. Schools held duck and cover drills. Entire generations grew up under the fear of sudden annihilation. Political crises like the Berlin blockade, the Korean War, and later the Cuban Missile Crisis pushed humanity to the brink. At any moment, the push of a button could end everything. And yet, paradoxically, this fear maintained a fragile peace. The concept of mutually assured destruction, MAD, became the grim logic of survival. If both sides could destroy each other, neither would dare to strike first. The legacy of the Manhattan Project expanded beyond the bomb itself. Nuclear technology began to reshape the modern world. Reactors were built to generate electricity, offering the promise of limitless energy. Submarines and aircraft carriers were powered by atomic fuel, and medical science used radiation to diagnose and treat disease. But with progress came new dangers: radioactive waste, environmental contamination, and the constant risk of accidents. Names like Chernobyl and Fukushima would later become synonymous with disaster. And behind every advance lurked the same question that had haunted Oppenheimer. Could mankind control the power it had unleashed? By the 1960s, the nuclear arms race reached staggering proportions. Thousands of warheads were built and deployed, missiles hidden in silos and submarines, ready to strike at a moment's notice. Treaties were signed. The Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963, the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968, attempts to slow the race, but distrust remained. Espionage thrived. Spies like Klaus Fuchs, who had secretly passed Manhattan Project secrets to the Soviets, revealed how porous the walls of secrecy had been. The atom secret had escaped long ago, and no government could ever fully contain it. Culturally, the bomb cast a long shadow. Art, literature, and film reflected the dread of nuclear war. From the surreal horrors of Dr. Strangelove to the bleak desolation of On the Beach, humanity tried to make sense of a world where extinction could come in an instant. The atomic age had reshaped not just geopolitics, but the human psyche itself. Children grew up learning about fallout shelters, not fairy tales, and entire generations came to see the future not as hope, but as a countdown. Science, once the beacon of progress, became intertwined with fear.
For the scientists of the Manhattan Project, the years after the war were marked by reflection and regret. Many continued to work in physics and education, yet few could escape the moral weight of their creation. Niels Bohr spoke of the need for an open world where knowledge could unite rather than divide. Fermi died relatively young, having lived long enough to see the world he helped change. Richard Feynman turned to teaching, using humor and simplicity to inspire a generation to think deeply about ethics in science. But for Oppenheimer, the shadow never lifted. He spent his later years lecturing, writing, and contemplating the paradox of his life, that in trying to save the world from tyranny, he had given it the means to destroy itself. In 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson presented Oppenheimer with the Enrico Fermi Award, a gesture of partial redemption. But by then, the damage was done. Oppenheimer had become a tragic figure, brilliant, misunderstood, and haunted. He died in 1967, his health broken by throat cancer, his reputation still divided between hero and heretic. Yet time would soften judgment. Historians and scientists alike would come to see him not merely as the maker of the bomb, but as a man who had stared too deeply into the abyss of knowledge.
As the 20th century advanced, nuclear weapons remained both a shield and a curse. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to within a breath of nuclear war. Only diplomacy and luck prevented catastrophe. From that moment, leaders began to recognize the urgent need for restraint. Arms control talks followed. The SALT agreements of the 1970s, the INF Treaty of the 1980s, and the eventual easing of tensions as the Cold War waned. Yet the weapons never disappeared. They merely changed form. Smaller, faster, more precise, but still capable of ending life on Earth. Even after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the fear persisted. Rogue states, terrorism, and accidents kept the nightmare alive, and the legacy of the Manhattan Project continued to echo through every policy decision and moral debate. Beyond politics and war, the project had changed humanity's relationship with science. It showed that intellectual discovery could no longer exist in isolation from its consequences. Scientists could not simply say, "We only provide knowledge," for knowledge itself had become power, and power demanded responsibility. In classrooms and conferences, in films and philosophy, the ghost of the Manhattan Project lingered, reminding every generation that intelligence and morality must evolve together.
Today, the remnants of the Manhattan Project are preserved in museums, monuments, and declassified documents. The desert of New Mexico remains eerily silent, yet beneath its sands lies the memory of that first blinding light. Hiroshima and Nagasaki have rebuilt, their cities thriving, yet their shadows, etched into stone and story, continue to bear witness. Every August, when bells ring in remembrance, the world is reminded that progress without humanity leads only to ruin. The Manhattan Project was not merely a historical event. It was a transformation of human destiny, a mirror held up to our own capacity for creation and destruction. It proved that within a single thought, a single equation, lies the power to reshape existence itself. And so the story continues, not in laboratories or deserts, but in the choices of nations, in the ethics of scientists, in the hopes and fears of ordinary people who live beneath the silent sky that could, in an instant, turn to fire. From Los Alamos to Moscow, from Hiroshima to Washington, the legacy endures, a testament to genius, ambition, and the eternal question of what it means to be human in a world that holds the power of the sun in its hands. For as long as the atom exists, so too will the memory of those who first broke it apart, and the world that followed will forever live in their shadow. By the dawn of the 1970s, humanity had settled uneasily into the nuclear age. The fear of sudden annihilation had become part of everyday life, not through open panic, but through quiet acceptance. Television programs interrupted their broadcasts for emergency alerts. Sirens were tested monthly, and politicians spoke in cautious tones about deterrence and peace. Yet beneath those words lay the same truth. Every superpower lived under the same shadow it had created. The atom had become both protector and executioner, and the balance of terror was the new normal. While the Cold War raged silently in the corridors of power, the people of the world went about their lives, building families, dreaming of futures, pretending the threat was distant. But deep down, everyone knew that the illusion of safety depended on the logic of fear. The 1970s brought not only tension, but transformation. Technology advanced at a staggering pace. Computers, satellites, and communication systems made the world smaller, yet more fragile. Governments learned to wage war not just with bombs, but with information. Espionage and propaganda became weapons as potent as missiles. While both the United States and the Soviet Union expanded their arsenals, they also began to explore ways to prevent their own destruction. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT I and II, attempted to draw invisible lines in the sky. Agreements meant to limit, not eliminate, the capacity for mass death. But distrust remained. For every treaty signed, another missile was built, another spy caught, another crisis narrowly averted, and the dance of fear continued.
Culturally, the idea of nuclear apocalypse seeped into every form of expression. Filmmakers imagined the end of the world not as fantasy, but as a likely future. Songs carried the anxiety of generations raised under mushroom clouds. From the haunting chords of 99 Red Balloons to the bleak poetry of The Final Countdown, art became a form of warning, yet also of resilience. For if humanity could not prevent the end, it could at least bear witness to its own fears. Literature, too, reflected the existential dread. Novels like On the Beach and A Canticle for Leibowitz asked whether civilization could rise again after the fire, and, perhaps more importantly, whether it deserved to. But amid the dread, hope found small footholds. The rise of nuclear energy as a promise of clean power seemed at first a redemption. Atomic energy plants spread across the industrial world, their shining domes symbolizing progress and control. Governments spoke of a future powered by the same atom that once destroyed cities. Scientists envisioned endless energy and prosperity. But the promise soon revealed its cracks. Accidents at places like 3 Mile Island in 1979 shattered public faith, and whispers of what might happen if safety failed grew louder. People began to question whether any human system could truly control something so vast and invisible. And the dream of the peaceful atom began to dim.
The 1980s arrived like a storm, with Ronald Reagan in Washington and Mikhail Gorbachev rising in Moscow. The world seemed poised between confrontation and reconciliation. Reagan's rhetoric of evil empire reignited old tensions, while new missile systems like the Pershing II and the SS-20 brought nuclear war closer to European soil. Yet, paradoxically, it was also the decade when peace seemed possible. Through the haze of paranoia, dialogue began. And in 1987, the INF Treaty marked a turning point, eliminating entire classes of nuclear weapons. It was as if the world, after decades of living on the edge, had finally taken a breath. Oppenheimer's ghost, though long gone, seemed to linger in every negotiation room, reminding leaders of what awaited if they failed. Meanwhile, scientists continued to probe the atom, not for destruction, but for understanding. Particle accelerators, quantum theory, and space exploration all emerged from the same scientific lineage that had once split uranium. The quest for knowledge endured, but the lessons of the Manhattan Project were never far. Every discovery now carried with it the silent question, what will this be used for? And in that awareness lay the evolution of human conscience. The age of blind ambition had ended. The age of responsibility had begun.
The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the collapse of the bipolar world that the bomb had defined. Suddenly, the Cold War was over, and yet the weapons remained. Thousands of warheads still sat in silos, rusting but ready. The Soviet Union's dissolution in 1991 unleashed a new fear, that nuclear weapons might fall into the wrong hands, rogue states, extremists, or desperate generals. The illusion of stability vanished, replaced by chaos. The 1990s became a decade of redefinition. Treaties sought to control proliferation, while scientists worked to secure fissile material. And yet nuclear tests continued. India, Pakistan, North Korea, proving that the hunger for power could not be contained by treaties alone. In the post-Cold War world, the nuclear narrative shifted again, no longer about global annihilation, but about small, unpredictable threats. Terrorism, black market uranium, cyber warfare. The same fear had evolved, but not disappeared. It had fragmented, like the atom itself, into countless invisible dangers. And once again, humanity stood unprepared for the complexity it had created. The 21st century dawned under the shadow of a different kind of war, one fought with drones, algorithms, and codes, yet always with the unspoken presence of the nuclear sword hanging above.
Chernobyl in 1986 and Fukushima in 2011 stood as grim reminders that the line between control and catastrophe remained thin. The images of abandoned cities, of invisible radiation haunting forests and rivers, became modern monuments to hubris. People realized that the atomic age was not a chapter of history, but a continuing condition. As long as the reactors hummed and the warheads waited, the story was still being written. And through all of it, the figure of Oppenheimer returned, not as a man of the past, but as a timeless symbol. His face in black and white, his words, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds," echoing in every debate about artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, or any new force that promised power without foresight. The Manhattan Project had not only built a bomb, it had built a metaphor for all human innovation. It showed that the line between progress and peril is drawn not in science, but in conscience. In classrooms, young students study the atomic age as history. Yet it is not history. It is the air they breathe, the energy that powers their cities, the policies that shape their future. Every satellite, every reactor, every piece of technology owes something to that moment in 1945 when humanity first split the atom. The bomb became both a wound and a teacher, showing that knowledge without wisdom is the most dangerous weapon of all.
And so, as the 21st century unfolds, the legacy of the Manhattan Project continues, not as a closed story, but as a mirror reflecting each generation's moral choices. The scientists of Los Alamos are long gone, their laboratories turned into museums, yet their creation still defines geopolitics, philosophy, and fear. The power they unleashed remains in the hands of those who never saw the blinding light of Trinity, and perhaps that is the true danger. Not that we built the bomb, but that we learned to live with it, comfortably, quietly, as if it were just another part of the world, until one day it might remind us again what it truly is. For in the end, the Manhattan Project was not simply a scientific endeavor or a military operation. It was the moment humanity crossed a threshold from which there is no return. It was the dawn of an age where creation and destruction became indistinguishable, and every discovery since has carried its echo. The age of fear became the age of awareness, and perhaps in that awareness lies the faint hope that what was once built to destroy might someday teach us how to survive ourselves.
As the new millennium unfolded, humanity entered an era that Oppenheimer himself could scarcely have imagined. An age not defined by bombs or armies alone, but by invisible networks of data, code, and light. Yet beneath the glass screens and satellites orbiting above, the same question lingered. Had the lessons of the atomic age truly been learned, or merely buried beneath convenience and progress? For every generation believes itself wiser than the last, and yet the rhythm of human ambition repeats like the pulse of a reactor, steady, relentless, glowing with the same promise and peril. The name Oppenheimer, once whispered in classified reports and political hearings, returned to public consciousness as myth, symbol, and warning. His life became the embodiment of the duality that defines the modern age. The brilliance of creation, bound forever to the guilt of consequence. Students studied his equations not only for their genius, but for their moral weight. Filmmakers turned his story into art. Poets used his words as prayers, and historians traced his sorrow like the echo of a detonation that never truly ended.
The world that emerged from the shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became one obsessed with control, of nature, of technology, of destiny. Yet the illusion of mastery proved fragile. The nuclear age had shown that every tool powerful enough to change the world could also destroy it. And as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and climate engineering rose to prominence, many began to see the same moral reflection that haunted Oppenheimer, the same trembling awareness that power and understanding were not the same thing, that intelligence without humility could become a curse. Scientists of the 21st century often invoked his name not in celebration, but in caution. In laboratories where atoms were split, genes edited, and algorithms trained to mimic human thought, Oppenheimer's ghost seemed to hover, asking softly, "Do you understand what you are creating?" And though the question was ancient, the silence that followed was always new, for each generation must answer it in its own time, under its own kind of light.
Nations, too, continued to wrestle with the inheritance of the bomb. As the United States maintained vast arsenals, Russia rebuilt its might, and new powers, China, India, North Korea, rose with ambitions of their own. The logic of deterrence, once thought to guarantee peace, began to resemble a fragile equation held together by chance. Accidents, near misses, and miscalculations haunted the record of the nuclear age. A radar glitch, a false alarm, a human hesitation. These, not strategy, had saved the world more than once. And so the fate of humanity still hung on the trembling hand of reason. In an ironic twist of history, the same technology born from nuclear research now powered medicine, energy, and exploration. Radioactive isotopes cured cancers. Reactors lit cities. Spacecraft carried human probes beyond the solar system. The atom that once symbolized death now sustained life. And yet the balance remained delicate. For every act of creation carried within it the memory of destruction. Every bright city skyline was, in some quiet sense, illuminated by the fire of 1945.
Museums and memorials across the world tried to capture this paradox. In Hiroshima, the Peace Memorial Dome stood silent against the sky, its fractured frame untouched since the blast, surrounded by flowers and schoolchildren who came to learn what words could not describe. In Los Alamos, exhibits displayed instruments, notes, and models frozen in time. Yet the air itself seemed heavy with the knowledge that here, once, humanity had touched something divine and terrible at once. And even the desert of New Mexico, long quiet since the Trinity Test, still bore invisible traces of that first light, the sand fused into green glass by the explosion. The earth itself marked by the moment when man first imitated the power of the stars. Philosophers, theologians, and scientists alike continued to debate what Oppenheimer's legacy truly meant. Some saw him as a tragic hero, others as a warning. But perhaps he was both. His story was not just about science or war, but about the eternal tension between knowledge and morality. His brilliance revealed not the power of the mind alone, but the danger of its isolation. For in the pursuit of truth, he had glimpsed the void, and it had looked back.
And yet, amid all this reflection, life continued. Children were born, cities rebuilt, technology advanced. The bomb became history, then memory, then symbol, and eventually background noise. Something always there, unseen but present, like gravity, shaping decisions without being spoken. Every act of diplomacy, every conflict, every policy discussion carried its shadow. And though people no longer looked to the sky in fear of a mushroom cloud, the logic of the bomb still governed the world. Silent, invisible, inevitable. The digital age brought a new illusion, that humanity had transcended the dangers of the atomic past, that war could now be fought in cyberspace, bloodlessly, abstractly, with lines of code instead of fire. But beneath the screens and satellites still slept the same machines, the same arsenals waiting in silos and submarines, the same promise that one wrong command could end everything. And perhaps the greatest tragedy of the modern world was not that people lived in fear, but that they had learned to live without it, that the unbearable had become ordinary.
In universities, students now discuss Oppenheimer alongside Prometheus, the mythic bringer of fire who suffered for giving knowledge to mankind. And the parallel feels almost perfect, for both stories end not in triumph, but in torment. Both teach the same lesson, that the price of enlightenment is the loss of innocence. The Manhattan Project, stripped of its secrecy and myth, remains humanity's most profound confession that even in our quest to protect ourselves, we may become the very thing we fear. And so the legacy continues, not as a single event, but as a constant whisper in the mind of civilization. Each time we launch a rocket, build a reactor, or create a machine that thinks for itself, the same question arises: what are we unleashing this time, and can we control it? The story of the atom is no longer about one man, one bomb, or one war. It is about the eternal struggle to wield creation without destruction, to touch the light without being consumed by it. And perhaps in that struggle lies the only hope humanity has ever truly possessed. For as long as the world spins beneath the same sun that burns with atomic fire, Oppenheimer's shadow will stretch across the centuries, a reminder that every dawn is a choice, and that the same light that can warm the earth can also turn it to ash.
After the fire had faded and the cities rebuilt, after the speeches, the trials, the treaties, and the endless years of peace built upon fear, humanity found itself facing not the ruins of war, but the ruins of meaning. For the bomb had not only destroyed cities, it had reshaped the human soul. Once people had believed in progress as an upward path, in science as a light that would guide civilization forward. But the atom proved that light could also blind, that knowledge could destroy as easily as it could heal. And from that realization emerged a new kind of awareness, fragile, haunted, uncertain, yet deeply human, the understanding that to possess power is not the same as to deserve it. In the decades following the Second World War, entire generations grew up under the silent weight of nuclear memory. They did not see the flash nor hear the thunder, but they felt it in the structure of the world, in the maps divided by ideology, in the language of deterrence, in the careful diplomacy that shaped every headline. The atomic shadow stretched across everything, from classrooms to cinema, from religion to philosophy. It changed how people thought about life and death, about God and man, about the limits of human reason. The old myths of divine punishment were replaced by a new myth, that man himself had become capable of ending creation, that apocalypse was no longer an act of heaven, but of human hands.
The survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the hibakusha, became living symbols of that new truth. Their scarred bodies and quiet dignity turned into living testaments, not just to the horror of war, but to the endurance of life. They walked among nations that preferred to forget, and in their silence there was an accusation, not of hatred, but of remembrance. They spoke softly at peace conferences and memorials, yet their presence said more than any speech could. They reminded the world that what had been done once could be done again, that the power to erase cities was not a nightmare, but a policy written in budgets and treaties. As time passed, the distance between the event and the memory grew. The generation that built the bomb vanished. Those who dropped it aged into history, and the new world that rose in their place treated the atomic age as a lesson already learned. But memory does not vanish. It mutates. It becomes metaphor, culture, instinct, the fear that lives beneath confidence, the humility beneath pride, the whisper that says, "Remember what you are capable of." And so the reckoning continued, not in laboratories or parliaments, but in hearts, in art, in the quiet spaces where humanity asks itself what it truly wants to become.
Artists and writers took up the burden of memory where politicians would not. They painted skies on fire, wrote novels where the world ended and began again, composed music that captured the sound of silence after destruction. Through them, the story of the atom became not just history, but myth, a sacred warning encoded in beauty. The way ancient civilizations carved their tragedies into stone, modern civilization recorded its guilt in film and song. From the ghostly echoes of Hiroshima Mon Amour to the defiant rage of post-war poetry, art became the conscience of the nuclear age. But reckoning is never simple, for humanity has always sought to forget what it cannot bear to remember. And so the same technology that once terrified the world became background noise. Power plants hummed quietly on the edges of cities. Submarines slipped beneath the oceans with silent arsenals. Satellites carried signals through space, built on the same physics that split the atom. And in the hum of electricity and data, the memory of fire faded, replaced by the illusion of control. And yet, deep within the silence, the old fear remained, not spoken, not seen, but always there, like the heartbeat of history itself.
The Cold War may have ended, but the bomb never left. It simply changed its shape, its presence woven into the structure of geopolitics, its threat encoded in the language of deterrence, its existence rationalized by the same logic that created it, that peace could be built upon fear. And so the world lived on, prosperous but precarious, civilized but trembling. The same paradox that haunted Oppenheimer's mind continued to haunt nations. Can something born of destruction
ever be truly used for peace. And yet, amid the vast machinery of deterrence, there were moments of genuine reckoning when humanity dared to look at itself without illusion. The NPT conferences, the disarmament treaties, the movements for nuclear-free zones, the global protests that spread after Chernobyl and Fukushima. These were not acts of rebellion, but of remembrance, the collective attempt of humanity to reclaim its innocence, to prove that it could learn, that it could look into the abyss and step back. And perhaps those moments, small though they were, mattered more than all the grand strategies that came before.
In classrooms across the world, children now learn of the atomic bomb not as a weapon, but as a turning point, a moment when humanity first saw its reflection and did not look away. They learn that science is not evil, that curiosity is not dangerous, but that every discovery carries a mirror, showing not just what we can do, but who we are. And perhaps that lesson, quiet, patient, passed from teacher to student, is the true legacy of the nuclear age. Not the fear, not the destruction, but the understanding that wisdom must grow as fast as knowledge, or both will collapse together. And so humanity stands once more at the crossroads, facing new forms of power, artificial intelligence, genetic manipulation, climate control. And again the same question echoes from the desert of New Mexico, from the ruins of Hiroshima, from the ghost of Oppenheimer himself. Do you understand what you are creating? The tools have changed, but the truth has not. Power without conscience is self-destruction. Knowledge without compassion is madness, and history without memory is repetition.
The reckoning of the atomic age, then, is not a story of the past, but a mirror of the present. It reminds us that we are not gods, only creatures who have glimpsed the divine and the terrible, and must now choose which to follow. And though the fire of the bomb has cooled into history, its light still shines, not as threat, but as warning, as hope, that by remembering what we once unleashed, we might yet learn to build a future worthy of surviving it. For perhaps the true measure of civilization is not in its power to destroy, but in its ability to remember and still create. And somewhere, in the quiet places of the earth, where deserts stretch and oceans breathe, the wind still moves over the glassed sands of Trinity, whispering through the silence, carrying the same eternal message that began it all, that knowledge is fire, and fire, if held without wisdom, will always burn the hand that dares to hold it.
The future does not arrive with explosions or fanfare. It comes quietly, on the breath of time, in the turning of generations who no longer remember the sound of sirens, who have never seen the sky lit by fire, and yet who live within the architecture built by those who did. The world of the 21st century is a child of the atom, born from its light, haunted by its shadow. And though the language of fear has changed, the essence of power remains the same. It is still the dream and the danger, the same equation that Oppenheimer and his peers once solved in the deserts of New Mexico, now written in code, in genomes, in neural networks. Humanity has not escaped the fire. It has only learned to name it differently. The last light of the nuclear age is not the flash of detonation, but the glow of memory, the awareness that survival itself is an act of learning, and every generation must relearn what the last nearly forgot, that knowledge demands humility, that progress is not linear but circular, forever returning to the same moral questions in different forms. We build machines that think. We map the genome. We alter the climate. And each time we tell ourselves that this time is different, that we have learned, that we will not repeat the same mistakes. But beneath those assurances, the same rhythm pulses, the same heartbeat that drove the first scientists to spit the atom, curiosity mixed with fear, genius bound to pride, and always the hope that understanding will lead to salvation rather than ruin.
In this new century, the weapons have grown silent, but smarter, invisible, but omnipresent. A drone's hum replaces the roar of bombers. Algorithms predict conflict before it begins. Machines decide who lives and who dies with the cold precision of probability. The dream of perfect control returns, just as it did in the laboratories of Los Alamos. And yet, the deeper humanity dives into control, the more it is reminded of its fragility, of the impossibility of mastering chaos. For every new technology born in the name of peace carries the potential for destruction. Every innovation is both promise and peril. And perhaps that is the eternal nature of human creation, that we cannot make light without casting shadows. But amid the complexity and fear, there are also quiet triumphs, moments where memory shapes mercy, where remembrance becomes resilience. The treaties that survive, the activists who persist, the survivors who still speak, the scientists who refuse to forget the moral weight of their equations. These are the guardians of the last light, those who understand that progress without conscience is blindness, and conscience without courage is silence. They are the ones who keep alive the memory of what the atom revealed, that the smallest particle can hold the destiny of worlds, and that within every act of creation lies the possibility of compassion.
In the deserts where the first bomb was born, the wind still carries the dust of glassed sand, but around it now stand observatories, solar arrays, telescopes that reach for the stars, symbols that the same human spirit capable of destruction is also capable of wonder. For the universe has always been both teacher and mirror. It offers infinite power, but asks a simple question in return. Are you ready for it? And perhaps that question, asked not by gods or fate, but by our own reflection, is the final test of civilization. Whether we can look upon the fire we have made and choose to use it to light the darkness instead of burn the world. Generations that follow may not remember the names, may not know Oppenheimer or Groves or Fermi or Teller, may not study the fear that once shaped nations, but they will live within its legacy. The communication systems built from wartime research, the energy grids powered by atomic theory, the medicine born from radiation, the peace maintained by the silent threat of destruction. Even the stars humanity now seeks to reach are followed through the same physics that once turned sand to glass. And so, even if they do not remember, they will still be guided by memory's light. For the past is not behind, but within, encoded in the very structures of civilization.
The last light of the Manhattan Project is therefore not destruction, but awareness. The knowledge that humanity has the power to end itself, and that this knowledge, terrible as it is also the seed of wisdom. For only by seeing how close we came to oblivion can we begin to understand what it means to live, to choose restraint over dominance, to build rather than consume, to remember rather than forget. Every scientist who looks into the core of an atom now sees not just particles and waves, but the reflection of that first dawn over New Mexico, and in that reflection lies both warning and hope. Perhaps, then, the true victory of the atomic age is not in the wars it ended, nor in the power it unleashed, but in the consciousness it awakened. Humanity's understanding of itself as both creator and destroyer, bound forever between divinity and disaster. It is this awareness, painful and profound, that defines the New Age, an era in which memory becomes the only safeguard, where history itself is the last defense against repetition, where the light of understanding, though born in fire, can still guide us toward peace.
In cities that shine at night, in hospitals where radiation saves rather than kills, in the hum of reactors and the glow of screens, in every pulse of electricity that flows through the modern world, the echo of that first atomic moment still beats, not as terror, but as truth. That power is never evil in itself, only in how it is used, that science is neither savior nor demon, but a mirror held up to humanity's soul, and that in choosing what to do with knowledge, we define who we are. And somewhere, in a quiet classroom or a museum where the story of the bomb is told, a child will look at a photograph of the Trinity explosion, the first sun made by human hands, and ask, why did they do it? And in that question lies the entire weight of history, the entire hope of the future. For as long as someone asks, as long as someone remembers, there is a chance that the fire will remain contained, that light will prevail over darkness, that humanity will finally learn not only how to create, but how to care,